Since the start of the war, allies have sent billions of dollars worth of weapons and military aid to Ukraine, including the much sought-after Leopard 2 tanks. Just today, Canada announced another 4 battle tanks for Ukraine. Allies have also launched a coordinated sanctions campaign against Russian officials and oligarchs. Plus, there has been a price cap put on Russian oil as the EU expedites its move away from Russian energy. So, 365 days in, and with no end in sight, is this strategy working? Joining me now are CTV's military analyst, retired Major General David Fraser. He's the former commander of NATO forces in southern Afghanistan, and Heritage Capital Management CEO Bill Browder. He's also the architect of Magnitsky-style sanctions. Those sanctions aim to punish human rights abusers. Browder is the former business partner of Sergei Magnitsky. Magnitsky testified against Kremlin officials and subsequently died while in custody. Browder is also the author of the best-selling books about these sanctions called Red Notice and Freezing Order. David Fraser, Bill Browder, welcome to Power Play. It's good to have you on the show. Mr. Browder, I want to ask you today about the G7 leaders announcing more sanctions against Russian officials and financial institutions and third countries that support Russia. Now, tell us how effective you think these new round of sanctions are.
Well, so we need to look at sanctions in the whole, and if we look at sanctions right now, Russia has been sanctioned more heavily than any other country has ever been sanctioned in the history of sanctions. So these are very serious sanctions. You went through the sort of list of them. There's a lot longer list of banks that can't do business, the imports that can't be done, oligarchs who can't get access to their money. But there's one huge loophole in this whole situation, which is that Russia continues to sell oil and gas in the amounts of between $500 million and $1 billion a day. And that money that accrues to Russia from the sale of oil and gas could keep this war going into perpetuity. And if the purpose of sanctions is to basically make it impossible financially for Putin to conduct this war, we need to figure out what to do with this oil and gas, and we haven't figured that out yet.
That's interesting. David Fraser, Canada sending 4 more Leopard 2 tanks. That's 8 in all that Canada sent. We know Germany, U.S. sending tanks as well. Give us an idea of how that can change the dynamic on the ground when this aid is measured against, the Russian war machine.
Well, Joyce, first of all, we have to take the aid and put it into the 300 plus that the West has already committed in the way of tanks. And tanks by themselves will not change the scope of this battle. It is the tanks working with the infantry, working with the engineers and all the other vehicles that the Americans had actually gave Ukraine about a month ago. That capability represents something that Ukrainians do not have, and it should give Ukraine the ability to change the stalemate of this war. And that is the race right now, is who can actually launch this capability faster. Ukraine can do it before the Russians try to counter it, or will the Ukrainians be able to go and actually break stalemate? But this is a complex problem that's not just about tanks. It's about how do you put all the tanks, the air defense, the missiles, the helicopters all together, working together to actually break through that line, to actually make a change in the battlefield. It's not about equipment. It's about how to put it all together. And that's complicated stuff. And the Ukrainians are good, but we haven't talked about, can they put it all together and use it? The Russians haven't, so can the Ukrainians? That's the question.
Mr. Browder, I want to go back to the sanctions because they hurt the individuals that they target, but they also hurt the population of Russia, the economy, the flow of goods and services. Russia's propaganda machine, is it still able to keep the public's support for this war?
Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. I think that Putin has very, very effectively stirred up a sort of Pandora's box of nationalism, of really sort of angry people angry at foreign invaders, angry at NATO, angry at Ukraine, and his support is very genuine. And the one thing, if the purpose of sanctions were to turn the Russian people against him, then they would have completely failed, because that hasn't happened. But the purpose of sanctions is not to do that. The purpose of sanctions is to deplete his resources, and it's done sort of half of the job. But as I mentioned before, there's still a lot more of the job to do.
Yeah, and you know, the ambassador to Canada, Oleg Stepanov, tweeted today, and he seems to agree with you, Canadian and Western sanctions against Russian citizens, state structures or businesses are meaningless. They'll never work against Russia. They can't influence our sovereign foreign policy or domestic affairs. I want to ask both of you, because you know, this is the one-year anniversary of this war. First, you, David Fraser, you know, the President of the United States was in Kyiv. He was asked by the President of Ukraine for F-16 fighter jets. He did not send them. You know, you said it was very complex, but would fighter jets then turn this around for the Ukrainians?
In a word, I don't think so. I mean, you know, every month we talk about a new weapon system. First, we started talking about rockets, and then air defense, and then it was about artillery, and then it was about tanks, and now it's about fighters. Ukraine needs everything, but at the same token, if we thought that tanks and the equipment that's going in today was complicated, fighters is a quantum above that. It takes years to train a fighter pilot in any Western nation, and to have them flying in an area, a combat zone, with some of the best air defense systems firing back at them being Russian, they're going to fly out of the sky. And it's not just about airplanes, it's about how do they all work together. What the Ukrainians need is just all the army stuff, the stuff that's on the ground that they have now, a lot more of it, to keep firing at the Russians. And then putting all that together should give them the capability to actually break the stalemate. But this is a race to see who can launch first, and a race to who can sustain that offensive capability. Whoever does that first will have a better chance of actually breaking this and being in a position where we can start to negotiate a diplomatic solution to this problem.
Wow, that kind of says it all. Retired Major General David Fraser and Bill Browder, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thank you.